Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Superhero Ethics production. Riki and myself will get started in just a few moments. We're just going to record about 15-20 seconds of silence, and then we'll jump right in. We're currently getting some noise from a fan in St. Louis, so if you could be a little quieter. Good job, Kansas City. Thank you. All right. Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Normally, I don't include that stuff at the beginning, but we decided to have a little fun, but probably in part because we're going to have a pretty heavy topic today. Riki and myself are going to be discussing the topic of child soldiers in the genre fiction that we love, science fiction and fantasy and all the rest, superheroes. And this is in some ways a continuation of one of our last episodes where we were talking about, what do we do with villains? What do we do with the people who work for villains? What do we do with, all these kind of things? And Jared Silva, who's a colleague of both of ours, had brought up the question of child soldiers, and particularly in terms of the Padawans from Star Wars and things like that. And we talked about it a bit on that, and realized though it was a much heavier topic and one that really there was so much depth to that we wanted to give it a whole episode. So thanks again to Jared, and a reminder to our listeners, give us the feedback. All the information is on the show notes. Just go to theethicalpanda.com. You'll find all of that. The Zen Madman, Paul, who is often a guest or was a host on this podcast for a while, has pointed out that the 20-second moment of silence for all the child soldiers. Yes, that's actually what it was. It has nothing to do with my needing it for editing purposes. That's a much better explanation of it. And I'm kind of joking there, but also a bit serious. I want to say part of why this is a heavier topic is that child soldiers are obviously a very real problem and a very real situation in our world today. And I think when we say that word, we often think about it in terms of some of the civil wars and revolutions that are happening in Africa, where the use of child soldiers has been very well documented. But I think you can talk about child soldiers in many parts of the world, certainly in Northern Ireland for a while, when that was an issue. I think you can look at the way kids of all backgrounds and all races, not just black as media wants to portray it, but the way kids can get wrapped up in gang culture at a young age and gang fighting and things like that. So just a reminder, this is we're talking about it in science fiction, in fantasy, but obviously what we're talking about has some very heavy real world connotations, which is, I think, part of why we wanted to talk about it, because so often it's a fun story about kids who want to go to, get to sign up and be a starfighter or be a general or be a Jedi. So, Riki, what was kind of your initial thought process in when we first got this question and wanting to think about doing a whole episode on it?
Well, I had been talking to you about wanting to do this topic even before that.
Oh, yeah, that's correct. You're correct. Thank you.
Because, I'm a fan of anime, specifically mecha anime, and pretty much every popular mecha anime features a main character piloting one of the giant robots who is a child, like a teenager, often a young teenager to start. So I had already broached the subject and I said, well, and also my Netflix algorithm is recommending Ender's Game, which is a Western example of this. And then I started going through stuff and was like, wait a minute, this is just a thing in everything we watch. You had around the same time mentioned you had rewatched War Games. And that, War Games and Ender's Game are both right around the same time, I believe, mid 80s, 1980s. And then there's another movie from that era, The Last Starfighter, which also fits that mold. And then
a classic, by the way, if you haven't seen it, I'm going to include a link to it on our show notes. Definitely check it out if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, kind of like a lost classic. I don't feel like it's even a cult classic that really gets talked about much these days. And then the anime, my favorite, Gundam, started in the 70s, but was very prominent in the 80s as well. So I was thinking about this, and it's why did we suddenly get this in the 80s? And I think it's because of technology, because computers had reached a point where they were actually a thing, right? Like home computers, Apple IIc, etc. And video games, especially. Nintendo Entertainment System, Atari. So kids are playing video games at this time, and all of these movies and TV shows, piloting a mecha is essentially a video game to some extent.
Yeah.
The Last Starfighter, literally like an arcade console game, is used as a recruiting tool by an intergalactic rebellion.
Right.
And then War Games, of course, is just like he was a hacker who thought he was playing a video game, and it turns out he was playing against like a Skynet.
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting. And I want to say more about this, but kind of actually, probably setting up the first point I'm going to make, I have a question for you. I know that in America, one of the things that I think really drove that change is that you started getting a lot of TV shows, particularly animated shows, that were driven primarily by a desire to sell toys to kids.
Sure.
Because, like you said, not only was it about the video game of the mecha, but actually selling the robot to kids. And we know like shows like He-Man and She-Ra came directly out of corporate wanting to sell these toys.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have the same thing in Japan? Like, are there animes that were like that Japanese toy makers were clearly trying to like push so that they could sell Gundam robot toys to kids and
of
stuff
course.
like that?
I mean, like Transformers is originally a Japanese product.
Yeah.
And that is probably I would guess the biggest toy seller in the 80s. Mm-hmm. It's possible towards the end, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles shows up. But to me, like 80s and kids' toys, I think of Transformers and Star Wars.
Yeah.
But you asked about Gundam. Like, Gundam is interesting because they chose to go less into toys and more into the plastic model kits, the Gunpla, which is still like often, kids buy them and build them. But right. it's very interesting that they chose not to go as much into the prepackaged toys, and they basically conquered that market. Like, the model kit market is synonymous with Gundam, probably like 80% market share.
That's really interesting. Okay.
Like, it is, because it used to be like you would build, like when I was a kid, I had Gunpla, but I also built like battleships and real world fighter jets.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of gone away, right? Like, if you build a plastic model kit, you're building a Gundam.
Yeah, I think, oddly enough, I think Lego has mostly replaced that market. Like, if you want to build a model Star Destroyer, you get the Lego Star Destroyer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's like cleaner and safer, right? Because you're not dealing with the epoxy glue and right. having to like cut stuff. So
there's no paint that kids are going to want to sniff, and as much you're not going to.
No, I agree. Lego is cornering in on the market, so I guess I'd be curious to see whether those are considered the same, right? By markets, by toy markets.
Well, and I don't want to go too far down this road, but I'm now really curious about it. Like, because when you talk to me about like miniatures of, of models that kids want to put together or adults want to put together and build and paint, I think about miniatures for warfare, like Warhammer type stuff. Were there Gundam games, or was it just about like creating this cool thing that they put on your shelf or play with, with you and your friends without like a specific set of rules attached?
No, to my knowledge, they are not, because like Gundam is usually scaled around 1 to 144, and I would say they stand about, I don't know, like close to a foot. So it's not something you would carry like a whole unit with you to a, like Warhammer, you just put them in the case and you could have like 2 dozen of them. No, Gundam is like mostly a display thing.
That's cool.
Like similar to the like superhero figures that you might see at a comic book store.
Right. Well, and then it makes sense, but I think it just further ties in that in both places, and probably I'm sure in other places around the world as well, I feel like part of the 80s was you get a lot more programming aimed at children, in part because of the explosion of this toy market. And so, and kids, as we've talked about, kids like to see themselves on screen. I think a lot of adults like to see kids as well because, nostalgia for our youth, or just because they're, I think like we've talked before that one of the things we love about Avatar is that they are younger kids and that there's just a different perspective that they have. I think the Percy Jackson books are another great example of this, and the Percy Jackson TV show, especially because when they were aged up for the movie, a lot of people didn't like that. And so, I think there I can understand why people like to put children into these stories and have them be heroic, and I think that's also kind of awesome. What's the flip side of it, though? Why, like, obviously we're doing an episode about it because I think we think that this might not always be the best thing. Um,
Yeah, I
so
mean, it's hugely problematic to have kids in war.
yeah,
Like you're absolutely right that you want to have some kind of audience projection. You want the kids watching your show to imagine that they could be a Gundam pilot. And I think there's a reasonable separation when you
mm-hmm,
have something as fantastic and futuristic as Gundam,
yeah,
because we're kind of starting to get there with robot technology, but it's not really feasible, right?
right,
Um, and the same with the Last Starfighter. Like, it's a funny concept that an arcade console game could be used to recruit to be a starfighter pilot, but we don't have
right,
starfighters. But I like it is 100% confirmed that the U.S. Army
yeah,
uses video games now, like Call of Duty in particular is a very prominent one, to recruit. Like
yeah,
whether like directly, like through promotions, like in the community in the game, or I know they have like a U.S. Army esports team
mm-hmm,
that goes
yep,
around and like does actual recruiting at events and stuff. And that's I don't know, like that's scarier when it's real.
yeah,
It is very easy for me to be like, yeah, like I enjoy Gundam. Like when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, I was like, yeah, I want to be a Gundam pilot. Like that was never going to happen.
mm-hmm,
But when you are using a real life warfare video game to promote and recruit for the army, then you're like, wait a minute, like this is getting a little
yeah,
sketchier.
and
Because like I want to bring up like we're talking about child soldiers, like what are the rules, right? Like
right,
we all recognize that there has to be rules, and I think specifically the Geneva Convention of 1949, additional protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions states state parties shall take all feasible measures to ensure that members of their armed forces who have not attained the age of 18 years do not take a direct part in hostilities. So that's the international law that most nations have agreed to at this
right,
point.
yeah, and it's interesting because I think we're kind of looking at how there's a couple different elements to this question. Because when I think of child soldiers, what comes to mind for me first, and I think for a lot of people, is like people who are like early teenagers or sometimes even like not teenagers, from like in a real world like 12 to 14, 15, and then in worlds like Ender's Game, it can go to like 8 even or 10. And so I remember when you first said Last Starfighter, it didn't really click for me at first because I think that character he's kind of just on that age where I think he's supposed to be a senior in high school. He's getting ready to graduate.
Yeah.
And so he's probably on that list of like 17, 18. But part of what that got me thinking about, and this is, I don't know if Paul is still listening, but I know it's a topic Paul and I have talked about quite a lot. That idea of 18 or over, like, I think if you have to have a guideline, I think a guideline is good. That's probably about a good age. But it also, it implies this idea that, like, some magical switch happens, and if you're 17 years and 364 days, you're not mature enough to be a soldier. But then the next day happens, and you get a party, and suddenly you're able to be a soldier, which I think, like, there are 25-year-olds who are not ready to be soldiers, and there probably are 16-year-olds who are. Like, development is not an easy. I'm not saying 16-year-olds should be soldiers, to be very, very clear. But I think part of what also we're getting at there with Starfighter and with what happens in real world with Call of Duty and things like that is that it's one thing to say, like, we won't allow you officially in until you're 18. I mean, already I think that's problematic, but I think all kind of soldiers are problematic. But to be clear, with all respect to those who are in the armed forces, I'm talking about the recruitment that happens to them. But when you're talking about Call of Duty, when you're talking about the Last Starfighter, part of the idea here is that people are playing starting at 12, 13, or even much younger, And so, like, yes, maybe someone waits till their 18th birthday or their high school graduation to sign up for the military. But if they've been playing Call of Duty, which is specifically like made in an attempt to help people want to be in the military, like how much is the I don't want to say brainwashing feels like too strong a term, but definitely a like part of the concern with child soldiers, I think, is that kids can be more easily influenced. Not always, but certainly a lot of the time. And so like I think it's bad to like propagandize 14-year-olds and then put a gun in their hand. But I think part of what you've got me thinking of is propagandizing them starting at 14 or 12 or 10, but then not putting the gun in their hands till they're 18 actually isn't that much better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like the fiction that we are talking about starts to hint at a direction we are going with technology and military where it can become even more dangerous. Because you talk about a gun in your hand, but now we are fighting wars with drones, right? And who's to say that a 15-year-old isn't piloting a drone? I mean, like international law says that you shouldn't do that. But again, like I'm not a lawyer on the Geneva Conventions, so I don't know if it would actually prohibit that, because it is that quote unquote active combat, right? To pilot a drone. I think it is, but like obviously, like we can imagine lawyers who would argue that it isn't.
Right. Well, especially because I think like for me, part of the reason against child soldiers, I'm primarily thinking of like mental and like, psychological development and like I think there is an age young enough where you're just not really fully understanding of the consequences of your actions in a way that I think you really have to be if you are possibly killing other human beings. And we'll talk about how in Ender's Game, like that lack of knowledge is actually part of the point sometimes with younger soldiers. But also there's a physical development aspect. Some 15-year-olds are the size they're going to be as adults and could probably kick the ass of a lot of adults. Most aren't, though. Most 15-year-olds probably can't carry the 40-pound backpack the way a 22-year-old could. And so you're right. So there's kind of just a physical, like, you're not big enough to be a soldier yet, kid. Go grow up some more and then come back. But the flip side of that is that, yeah, you're right. If warfare is sitting in a building playing with a computer and as a result, dozens or hundreds of people are dying, yeah, you don't need those physical skills. So it becomes a lot easier to have people who aren't as physically mature, but have the dexterity or whatever it is that you need, or just the mental capacity. And so with that, let's actually transition into talking about Ender's Game specifically, because I do want to talk about some of these specific genres. And Ender's Game is definitely one of them. Do you want to give, for those, I think most people know the basics of Ender's story, but do you want to give like a quick summary for anyone who doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, the main character, Ender, is he like genetically modified? His parents are authorized by this is like very scary stuff. His parents are authorized by the government to have a third child because their genes are like so superior. But the first two children didn't turn out quite right. One was too violent, one was too compassionate. And then like the third one, Ender, is just right, like the Goldilocks of the gene pool, that because you can determine these things. And he is a genius. He's like recruited in the army at like 8 or something, like very young, like much younger than pretty much anything else, like in any of these fictions we're talking about, and goes to a battle school in space in orbit with zero gravity combat, and excels at these games. Ender's Game. He excels at these games where he's a commander of other child soldiers, like entire armies, who basically fight like zero gravity laser tag.
Right.
And he is so good at all this. The human military, it's like the world military at this point, because they are fighting against a race of bugs, an alien force of bugs who invaded Earth at one point, and they are preparing for what they say is the next invasion. But in fact, Earth is counter-invading. They've sent a fleet off already, and it reaches the bug space, And Ender and his fellow kids actually take command of this fleet unknowingly. They are told that they are just playing more games to help their training, but they are actually in command of a real fleet that is destroying bug planets and ultimately reaches the bug home planet. And Ender, again, thinks he's only playing a game, sees the insurmountable odds he's up against, and chooses to use a weapon. What do they call it? Doctor Device, I think.
Yeah,
It's a MacGuffin. It's a space nuke that can destroy an entire planet. And he chooses to use it in the game because in his mind, he's just fed up with it. He's like, they keep making the game harder and harder and impossible to win. F it, like I'm just gonna drop this nuke and like get out of the system. He thinks he's gonna wash out because of this, because he quote unquote broke the rules, right? So to speak. And then everyone is overjoyed because like he has destroyed the bugs, and he's like, what do you mean? And they finally tell him what's been going on, and it just breaks him because he has committed xenocide is the phrase that is used in this novel. And I think I liked it when I was a kid. I mean, I read this in high school, and it has a couple of sequels that are, I think, okay, pretty good. But when you think about it in this context, like it's terribly frightening.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, and it's interesting how the book gets played, because I think for a lot of kids, especially if you're kind of like the nerdy kid who's getting teased and maybe getting beaten up by bullies at your school and things like this, like for younger viewers, this may be harder to remember, but there was a time when like the geeks weren't the cool kids. Anyone who's old enough to getting shoved into a locker or something like that knows what I'm talking about. And so for me, like I think I actually read it as an adult, but I still had a lot of that nostalgia. But I think certainly for a lot of people who read this as kids, seeing a kid who was successful because he was smarter than everyone else was really, really appealing. And the book, I think the point that the author Orson Scott Card was trying to make, and to be clear, he's someone who I have a lot of disagreements with. He's fairly conservative on a lot of things. In later books, a lot of his homophobia and like Christianity in a conservative, problematic way kind of comes out a lot more. But I think he was onto an interesting point here. Well, the point I think he's trying to make is that this is horrific and terrible, but that it worked. Because that warfare is so awful that there's something in the human spirit that will like pull away from having to do the thing you need to do in the face of an existential threat. And that kids who to some extent haven't learned that yet, or just don't know that this is serious yet, won't do that. And I think the book is meant to keep it as an open question of, was this necessary to do? And to some extent, I think the book is somewhat arguing it wasn't, especially because part of what we later learn is that, this being an insectoid race, they think very differently about individual life, and that a lot of it, like we think of them as monstrous and genocidal. It's not, it's that they see things very differently, and that if there had been more peace attempts and communication attempts, maybe peace would have happened. But I think the book is written in such a way that you could come across thinking like, yeah, children should be in charge of everything. Children are smarter. Children are better. And there's some ways in which I really agree with that, and some ways in which I think you're kind of saying that in an existential threat, anything and everything is not good, but okay. And I think it's why I really like the book so much. And I think I come to different conclusions than the author, but I think it really does. At least this book tries to say this is going to be incredibly traumatic for kids, even if they don't realize it. In a way that I think a lot of the other works we're going to talk about, like Last Starfighter, it's kind of like, oh, it's fun, and it's like, oh, this poor kid that he's thrown into a war that he had no idea he was going to do, and he's 17. But there's never any discussion of like, oh, this was bad to do to him because he's so young,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Card, the author, I don't know, because like he wrote it in the 70s and 80s. We don't know what he was thinking. But it seems like he tries to walk back some of what he does in this first book with the sequels in
Mm-hmm.
terms of especially like the alien race, the buggers,
Mm-hmm.
and the miscommunication. I guess it's kind of there at the end, but it's not really addressed as well as some of the sequels do.
Yeah.
And there are like very interesting philosophical points about alien contact, miscommunication, first contact, and like also like how we view humanity
Right.
and like alien, like literal alien races in terms
Right.
of how they look. Because I think the idea of a bug, an insectoid alien race being benign is alien to a lot of the fiction that
Mm-hmm.
we consume. Like usually they are monstrous and like they're here to eat us and all that. And like I think Card does play into that. But then it's like, well, but let's imagine that they are not that.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of Ender, gosh, like he's broken. Like in the first
Mm-hmm.
book, he's broken. He goes into a deep depression after this, as he should. Like I don't
Yeah.
say like that he deserves it, but as a character should when they find out that they have committed xenocide.
Yeah.
And I think the adults who run the battle school like get away with it too much. I don't know that there's any consequences at all. Maybe it's like mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
but
I think there's like war crimes trials, but most of them are like they're all kicked out of the military,
yeah,
but like
like they
none of them
get
are
to
actually punished.
retire. They get to
Yeah.
retire comfortably. I feel like is the end
And,
result.
and to be clear, the things they're doing having real life consequences go much earlier before the war started. Because I think Ender actually goes to the school when he's like 5 or 6. Because part of the point is that he's a super genius from a very young age.
Yeah.
And there's a scene early in the book. Forgive me for spoilers, but this is like 30 years old, 40 years.
Even the
old.
movie is like 10
Yeah.
years old.
Where because part of what they're training him to do is again to be willing to be ruthless, to be willing to do what you have to do. And so at a very young age, he's being bullied quite cruelly, and the administration refuses to step in and protect him because they want to see what he will do. And what he does is wind up killing one of the kids.
And bullied, like he is confronted like 3 or 4 on 1 in the showers with no supervision, no protection, and they just like they're gonna wail on him, and he counter wails on them and kills the head bully.
Right. And the administrators wind up walking this line where, on the one hand, they don't want Ender to know that that kid died. So they lie to him and they tell him he decided to leave the school, but he's okay, don't worry about it. But also they're like, this is good, because what happened, we put him in a combat situation where the only way he could survive, as he understood it, was to use extreme measures, and then he did. And like, to me, that's almost like, that's a point where I really think you're supposed to be like, these guys are horrible and terrible. And that's why in some ways I hate that it works. Because
I fully agree.
Mm-hmm.
The adults are horrible, and I think this should be the point of a discussion like this is you got to have limits on like how young like you recruit or even use child soldiers, if at all. But the adults in the room have to be responsible.
Yeah.
And you said like even 25-year-olds might not be emotionally developed to be soldiers. Like, so even the adults, like the generals or whoever is responsible for soldiers have to be very, very responsible in terms of, how people are used, their mental and emotional states. And like, this is an ongoing problem, right? Like PTSD is a thing. And oftentimes like veterans who come back from wars are not properly taken care of. Like, I think that is also a discussion that has to happen. Like, not just how young do you recruit, but no matter the age, like take care of the people you are putting into horrible situations.
Yeah. like I know one of the problems they've dealt with the most in child soldier situations is that even when they are captured / rescued and like taken out of that situation, that often these kids are they have learned from an incredibly young age to be violent as a way to deal with problems, and it creates a lot of like social problems and things like that can last into adulthood. And I think and that's again where you get in the situation of like what we were talking about in the last episode about blame. Like obviously, like a 25-year-old who is harming others is a problem. But if that 25-year-old was raised to be a child soldier at 12, I want that to be taken into account when we're trying to figure out how to deal with this person. Um, I want to take a quick break just to say, I should do it again. I think one of the things that the Ender Game book also raises is this question of how much can you bend the rules or break the rules when facing an existential threat. And that's actually something that is brought up in the Clone Wars to some extent. And so I want to switch to talking about the question of, are the Padawans child soldiers, and how does that affect how we see the Jedi? I want to take a quick moment just to say, though, that if you enjoy conversations like this, if you want more people to hear them, please hit like, please hit subscribe, please share this with other people, get other people into the conversation. We love feedback. We're getting live feedback from Zen Madman, and we've had it from other people during recordings. I'm going to try and get better about letting people know when we're recording, but it's pretty much generally for the Star Wars podcast, 5:30 Central Time on Wednesdays, and for the Superhero Ethics, noon Central Time on Thursdays. But of course, if those times don't work for you, you can always just watch later and send us feedback. All that information is on the show notes, Twitter, Facebook. If you can figure out how to get a carrier pigeon into my house, carrier pigeons are, you got to be really, really nice to that bird. But if you can do it, go for it. Telepathy, I'm open to everything. Send us feedback. We'd love to hear it. And most importantly, if you want to support this podcast and also get even more of our content, please think about becoming a member. $5 a month or $55 a year gets you ad-free content, bonus content at the end of most of the episodes, and also bonus episodes. We've only been doing those in the Star Wars podcast, but starting in the late summer or fall, we're going to start doing that for Superhero Ethics as well. And it's also just a great way to support the podcast. And meanwhile, Zen Madman has been typing like mad, so I want to read a couple things from him and then get back to this question. First, he writes, there are a bunch of streamers, including friends of the show, Will Freeland, a.k.a. Silver Dreamer, who build Legos and Gundam and other models on stream. And it's a lot of fun to watch. I'll definitely put a link to his podcast in the show notes. Check that out. And Paul says he paused and is catching up on 2x speed, so I'm sure our voices sound fun. He then writes, I 100% agree with the point that 18 is arbitrary, and sure, I can't think of a better arbitrary age. And also says Avatar. And yeah, we're definitely going to get into Avatar: The Last Airbender in a second, or in a few minutes. But let me now put this question to you. Are Padawans child soldiers? And are the Jedi kind of not great for taking these children? Sometimes Padawans are almost adult age, or actually adult age, but still Padawans. But when a lot of times they're taking 12 and 13-year-olds into battle with them. Are Padawans child soldiers?
Absolutely. And not only that, they're child military leaders.
Yeah.
It seems like it's universal that the Jedi Masters and Knights are the rank of general, and then the Padawans are commanders, meaning that they have authority over pretty much every clone soldier, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is similar to Ender's Game, where Ender and his, I think it's Geesh is the word they use, is they are all basically admirals / captains of starships and fleets. And I don't know, like compared to Gundam, this is like very bad. Like in Gundam, the kids just pilot like one mobile suit. They're very good at it, so they are often like leading in combat, but it's always like one-on-one. They're generally not commanding other troops. So the idea of Padawans not just fighting as kids, but leading troops and ordering troops to their death. Like the Ahsoka show actually calls this out, where in the World Between Worlds episodes, Ahsoka talks with Ghost Anakin, and it's like a flashback to the first battle in the Clone Wars that they were in together, and she's like, how do I order people to their deaths?
Yeah.
And Anakin just kind of shrugs, like, well, you got to do what you got to do in war.
Yeah.
And it's terrible. I don't know what else to say about it, that it's terrible.
And I think when we say kids have like this can be incredibly traumatic for anybody, but especially for people younger. It's easy to take a kind of ageist idea of, oh, kids just aren't emotionally mature enough to handle these things. And I think it can often be the opposite. It's that kids aren't so jaded yet that they're okay with these things. Like, I think you can look at it either way. But either way, I think, yeah, Ahsoka is obviously troubled by that. But also look at Barriss Offee, the Jedi who winds up turning on the Jedi, in part because she thinks the Jedi aren't living up to the rules that they're supposed to. And she thinks the Jedi are so broken. She starts fighting as a very young child at like 12 or 13. And I think part of it is that a lot of the adults are just like, look, war is hell and the world is tough and that's how it is. And she kind of hasn't become that screwed up and cynical yet. And so for her, the problems are that much more inherent and problematic, and that's part of why she turns. And we can argue about her character specifically, but I think she is a great example of someone who got really screwed up because she was thrown into war at a very young age.
Yeah, and as we're seeing more of the fallout, like the more Star Wars we get of this era, we are seeing how many, I think, Padawans who fought during the Clone Wars were turned to the dark side, like in the Inquisitorius program, right? Because it was like, and you could argue that this is a subset of Palpatine's plan to break the Jedi Order, was to find a bunch of dark side recruits, people who would be broken by this war, and he could just like pick up the pieces and find the best ones to utilize for his purposes.
Yeah. And I mentioned the existential threat part because this isn't spelled out very much in the show, but very much in the books, including the now Disney canon books, that the Clone Wars is such a desperate situation for both the Republic and the Jedi. Like after the Battle of Geonosis, I think it's one of the books about Obi-Wan and Anakin. I think it's Brotherhood, but I could be wrong. But basically, one of the Jedi Masters gives a speech about how, look, first of all, like all Padawans who are like 17, 18, like you're Jedi Knights, congratulations. And we're going to give you new Padawans as well, and all of you are going to have to go out and fight. And we don't like this, but we have to because you are so young and because this war is so desperate. And that has really traumatic effects. Actually, I'm realizing it's not in that book. It's I think in Rise of the Red Blade. And part of the idea is that one of the reasons why some of the people who were Padawans fall to the dark side and become Inquisitors is because they were thrown into war at such a young age. And it really broke their brains in very understandable ways.
Yeah. I personally, my feelings on war are such that like it would be great if we didn't have them at all.
Yeah,
and
also true.
I understand that that's not the world we live in, and that certain things have to be done. In order to do those things, you, in my opinion, you have to break a certain amount of morality within everyone, right? Like, I think hopefully it's like a very natural impulse, and it's not even that. I don't know. I'm going to say it like this, that it's a natural impulse to not murder other humans. Or at least like that's how society has taught us at this point. And then like you have to take a certain subset of people and say, no, we actually want you to murder other humans for our purposes. And I do think like what you're saying with adults, there's a certain pipeline of indoctrination, I'll call it, which is what we're talking about here with like the recruitment, and now with like training in video games. Like you are indoctrinating a certain subset of people to be like, yes, not only is it okay to kill people, we want you, to want to kill people.
Right.
Like, that's kind of, what we're doing, right? And then with kids,
let me just say on that has a very long history. I mean, I'm sure there are examples of that going back millennia, but just as an example in our own history, in World War II and in World War I, but especially in World War II, in order to help Americans get over that, like, you can't kill a human being, there was an awful lot of propaganda that tried to dehumanize particularly the Japanese and portray them as like, hulking Asiatic monsters in these horrifically racist ways. And the specific goal of that was to be like, no, they're not human beings like you. You can kill them, it's okay. And similar things were being done on all sides in World War I between like the Germans and the French, and particularly aimed at the Russians because they weren't real Europeans and things like that. And so I think, and as you talked about, Ender's Game plays on the same thing of when we see like an 8-foot tall cockroach, there's a part of the, for most people that's probably like, it's horrifying, that's terrible, and that's part of what allows us to kill animals so freely, because they don't look like us, since we don't see them as life forms in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like with child soldiers, like I think where am I trying to go? Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
No, that's my fault for interrupting. I apologize.
I think what I wanted to say was that with children, you have to break the morality quicker.
Yeah.
To get them to that point.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like that. I guess that's where I'll leave it.
Or trick them into thinking that it's not real, like that happens with Ender's Game. Paul also points out in terms of the Star Wars that the clones are also child soldiers. And I think this is a really interesting thing, particularly in how Disney now has handled this, because in the EU and the Legends canon, and I think in some of the Clone Wars TV show, this is absolutely true. And in the Republic Commando Legends books, which are talked about a lot, there's a Jedi who spends a lot of time with the clones and touches the mind of one of them and says that's really confusing because in many ways it is the mind of an adult, but in many ways it's the mind of a child.
Yeah.
And she has like, at one point, like the two of them start falling in love, and she has real like issues that like, can this child consent to this? She comes to understand that in those regards, he's more of an adult. But it's really left kind of open of like, are they child soldiers? The Disney canon has never mentioned that idea once. And I think has kind of shifted more to the idea of part of the clone maturation process is that they are adults, both physically and mentally and psychologically. And you can argue, like, is that actually possible to do over 3 years' time instead of 10 years' time? And that gets into all questions of psychology and stuff. But Disney seems to be really, I think Disney seems to have recognized, oh, that's a bad topic.
No, like don't get into like, because the point, like, what is an adult, right? Like we've talked about physical bodies, and the cloning process is able to somehow subvert the natural aging process and age up a body to maturity, right? Like physical maturity in terms of strength and all that. What is an adult in terms of mind, right? Isn't it just memories? Like, because we have 18 plus years of memories and lived experiences, like that is what makes us adults and informs our morality and ability to interact with the world.
Right.
Can you implant those memories in a clone? And if you don't have them, like, because I presumably like they're able to do like Matrix style training of like, I know Kung Fu, like I know how to fire a blaster. Like they just quote unquote program that into their brains. But can you program morality? I don't know.
Yeah.
And I think they're right to not get into the weeds of that, because Star Wars, as much as we say it's sci-fi, like it's not hard sci-fi. Like these are not the things that
it's
we
space opera.
Star Wars dealing with. So I'm fine with them just like ignoring that to some degree.
The last thing I want to bring up, and I think this is one of the best arguments I've heard for the idea that Padawans really should be thought of as child soldiers, and that it's not just during this existential threat of the Clone Wars, which I don't think is an existential threat necessarily, because the Separatists just want to leave. Like, and you've heard me rant about that in other ways long beforehand. And obviously it becomes it with Order 66 and all that, but that's a different story. And this is a spoiler for the most recent episode of The Acolyte. So if you are not up to date with that, please skip ahead. I'm going to clap and make a big deal when we come back from it. And I'm actually going to put exact time notes in the show notes of when we start talking about this so that no one gets spoiled. So spoilers for The Acolyte in 3, and actually even in the chat, I will say we are now done with that. You can listen again. But spoilers for the Acolyte in 3, 2, 1. In the most recent, you've seen the most recent episode, right, Riki?
Yeah.
Okay.
I told you I didn't like it.
Yep. In the most recent episode, one of the Padawan who's been along with the group, Jackie, is killed by the person we realize is a dark side force user, Darth Biceps, as he's often referred by many, on the thirstier side of these discussions. Fantastic acting, beautiful human being, incredible. And when that happens, Soul says to Chimera, that character, how could you kill her? And Chimera responds, you're the one who brought her here. And like that line to me, just knowing we were going to record this, hit me so hard, because kind of what he's saying is like, you're blaming me for killing the child who you brought into a combat situation. And I mean, and like, when it's not like he just murders her out of the blue, she's actively trying to kill him because they're in a, and granted, he's been trying to kill others, like they are in a fight to the death, and he kills her as part of a fight to the death. And you can see how much that line hits Soul of, because what he's basically saying is like, you put this child into this life or death situation. And that to me hit me really hard as a like, yeah, the Clone Wars is when it gets really bad, but even hundreds of years beforehand, the Padawans were child soldiers, and that's a problem.
Oh, yeah, like in this situation, I would say more like a child cop, right? Like this is an investigation, and they're looking into a murder.
Right.
They're trying to find a murderer. So it isn't war, but it is absolutely like still a definite life-threatening endangerment situation.
Yeah, cop is, I think, actually at one point I had a theory about like, if the Clone Wars is about how the Jedi become soldiers, the High Republic is about how the Jedi become cops, which is the first step towards that. Yeah. And yeah, I think because they're investigating, they're not thinking it's a war necessarily, but they know that like they're investigating a killer, and so the killer might attack them. And so yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Okay, we are now done talking about the Acolyte. I'm going to put a note in chat.
So where are we? Like, do we want to address any other fiction?
I would say let's talk about Avatar, because
sure.
Avatar: The Last Airbender, as I see it, is a different kind of situation, but is related. Because on the one hand, like one thing I think is an important distinction that we haven't talked about is the difference between adults who are drafting child soldiers into their wars versus kids who want to run away and join the war, even though adults are trying to stop them. And like Full Metal Alchemist, I think, is a very interesting example that I really love, where it's kind of in the middle, where like there are some people who are like, you're kids, you really shouldn't be in this fight. But then once they're in the fight, they're like, well, you can fight and we need you. And I don't want to rewatch that before I get into that too much, but I do think that show at least deals with the real trauma of it. Avatar, I think, actually shows two different examples of this, because you have the Avatar's friends, oh my God, why am I blanking on their names all of a sudden? Not Suki, Sokka, and begins with a K. Help me out.
Katara,
thank you. You have Sokka and Katara, and their father and a lot of the others around them are constantly saying, like, you're kids, don't be in this fight, go back home. And for the most part, they're not soldiers. They're not being asked to be on the front lines of the actual like battles, but they're certainly getting into fights a lot. And so those kids are like kids who the adults don't want to fight. But because Aang is the Avatar, everyone's like, well, it doesn't matter what age you are, because actually you're this reincarnation of this, ancient being. So you have to go fight our wars for us. And so I think they do a very interesting like back and forth there of having both kids who want to go to war and the adults are saying no, but for the Avatar, they're not only okay with it, they're telling him he has to do this. When at first, he kind of just wants to be a kid. He wants to just go off and like do sledding games with the penguins and other things that look really fun, but everyone around him is like, no, you're the Avatar, you have to fight.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these fictions present the protagonist as a chosen one, right? Like the Avatar is literally the only one who has all the four elemental powers in
Right.
this universe. In some of these other ones, like the Last Starfighter, the protagonist scores the highest on the video game. Like he achieves the high score, and that's what leads to him being recruited. So he's like exceptional at this craft. And in like a lot of the Gundams, like the child literally sometimes like falls into the mobile suit and starts fighting, and it's like, oh, like you are better at this than any of the adults. And they coin a term new type for like this special maybe psychic ability that some of these kids have. So yeah, like I don't know what to do with that, because Katara and Sokka are just kids, right? And that's, to me, that's separate from the Aang, the Avatar, who is literally the only one. And I don't know like how you treat that. Like he's also a kid, but he has magical superpowers. So in this universe, yes, I guess he has to do this because he's you know, element superpower guy.
Yeah, like they're and they do, and in fairness, there are some adults who are saying like you have the Avatar power from a young age, but you shouldn't actually be the Avatar until you become an adult.
Oh yeah.
But that we're in this like weird situation where you have to. But like, to me, it feels like this would, like, in some ways, for me, in some ways, the child soldier recruitment isn't necessarily saying, Aang, you have to do this, although that I think is problematic to be sure, but it's also whatever system was created that puts this power into young kids, because I find it hard to believe that every time an Avatar dies, and so now everyone knows that some like 10-year-old is now the Avatar, all the bad people in the world are just going to say, you know what? We're going to wait 8 years to try and conquer the world because it's not fair to have a child Avatar have to fight us. So we're going to wait. Like, I would imagine lots of times people would be like, oh, cool, the Avatar is only 11. Like, doors are open. Let's go. Let's do all the bad stuff.
The beginning of the war, the Fire Nation does their sneak attack on the Air Temple, the Air Nomads, to try to eliminate the Avatar for 10 to 20 years, or however long it takes, right? Like that's their plan, is a sneak attack to get rid of the Avatar so that they can execute their war without interference.
Paul also says Katara and Sokka are also kids who lost a lot to the war and decided on their own to get involved, which feels fundamentally different from being recruited as a soldier. Which I was saying a little bit about that at the beginning, but I think that he's saying it even better. That those two are in such a different place, and like I don't love that they want to fight, but I also feel like, again, that happens in our own world all the time. Like in places where people are oppressed, in Northern Ireland, in Palestine, in all over the world. I imagine in the Ukraine, like there are 16-year-olds who are running off to fight, 12, people much younger who are running off to fight because they see their own families being killed, their own homes being destroyed. And I hope that the adults can often be like, this isn't a great idea. But also I do think it's like a fundamentally different, but sometimes maybe in the shows, I think they often become great soldiers. And again, maybe like, I don't want to say like, again, that something magical happens the day you turn 18 and now it's okay for you to go kill people, but not when you're 17 and 360 days old. Like it's a big gray mass. And like coming up with rules for when war and soldiers are okay feels ridiculous because I think none of it's ever okay. But yeah, I think that's kind of the point, is that when you're running off to join your own and you haven't been propagandized in the same way, that feels very different.
But these rules exist now. Like this is international law, and you have to, like, if you've signed up for this, which most of the nations have, you have to follow international law. Like that's how laws work, right? And we talk about. Go ahead. Like I want to hear.
I feel like, for me, I do want there to be rules. I don't want there to be any war at all. I think there being rules of war is a really double-edged sword, because on the one hand, yeah, like if you have to have war, make it less brutal as possible. Like, killing soldiers is better than killing civilians, et cetera, et cetera. But also, I feel like there's a danger, and I think we very much saw this in the 19th century and early 20th century in this country, where there's this idea of that because there are so many rules to war, and that war, therefore, is almost this gentlemanly act, that it's okay. And I think in a situation where all sides are following the rules, then I think I agree with you. But a lot of the situations I just mentioned, you have oppressors that are breaking the Geneva Conventions left, right, and center. I don't think anyone is going to look at what Russia is doing in Ukraine and say, like, oh, yeah, there's no war crimes being committed. And, like, I certainly have my opinions about how many war crimes are being committed in Palestine by the IOF, the Israeli Offensive Force. And others disagree, and I understand that. But, you can look at Northern Ireland, you can look at India, Pakistan, you can look at like all these different situations around the world where if I'm 16 years old and soldiers are coming to my town and killing my family, and more of my friends and my family, and they're coming to destroy my home and my friends, if I pick up a gun to fight these people who are attacking us at 14, 15, 16, I don't think that's great for me. But I'm not going to blame the adult soldier who's like, hey, kid, here's some more ammo. Please, come join me right here. I'm going to blame the people who attacked me, who put me into a situation where I had to become a soldier. Does that make sense? Like, I don't think they should have to be, but I think, like, in a situation where you're getting close to being existentially wiped out or overrun, I don't want them to ever try and get children to be soldiers. But if people on the front lines in Ukraine are not, like, checking IDs when youngish looking people show up and say I'm 18, that's low on my list of the ethical problems I see happening in Ukraine, if that matters, if that makes sense.
I understand what you're saying, and I think there are different lines here. Like in an active combat situation, like you're talking about, like soldiers are coming through my streets and shooting people, like, and I'm a kid and I pick up one of these guns and shoot back. Like, to my understanding, like that is not a war crime. Like that's just active combat. Like stuff happens.
Right.
I think what the Geneva Conventions are saying is, like, if that kid comes to like their nation's army camp with their gun, yeah, like you have to take I think it uses language like reasonable measures to not have them continue in active combat. And as to your point of like checking ID and stuff, like, yeah, like there's a long history of people faking their age to join the military. And it happens. And I think all it's saying is, like, you have to be reasonable about it. Like, you have to try to take measures to have kids avoid being in these situations.
Right.
And I don't know that we can do better than that, because war is a mass complex confusion, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I guess what I'm saying is, like, do I think it's a bad thing for kids to ever be picking up guns and fighting? Yes. But, like, if the Russian invading army has 16-year-olds in it and the Ukrainian army has 16-year-olds in it, technically I think both are bad and both are probably violations of the Geneva Convention. But I'm much more concerned about the Russians. And if the Ukrainian is like, they never get around to prosecuting whatever Ukrainian lieutenant was like, I can't believe we're doing this, but we need every gun right now, so yeah, I'm not going to send you home. Like, I'm okay with that. That's kind of what I'm saying. It's kind of like, I hate that we ever have these needs for violence, but I think that when you are the group that's being attacked, when you are the group that's being oppressed, I don't want you actively seeking out kids, but I'm more sympathetic to war is hell and we had to do this.
So here's where I see what you're saying is that as the invader, Russia has built up their army and recruited and planned and trained soldiers, right? And as defenders, you are often like not at the luxury of doing that. You're just kind of like using the best of what you got.
Yeah.
But what I will say is like, so in my research, like the Geneva Conventions, there's a newer-ish provision called the Optional Protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Involvement of Children in Armed Conflict. Okay, that's a mouthful. It's shortened to OPAC, the Optional Protocol, it's often called. And this was like trying to draw a harder line of, the arbitrary line of 18 years and 18 years old, and trying to say like, you cannot even recruit people until they are 18.
No
Like
problem with that.
they wanted to draw this hard line of 18 years. Like you can't even recruit people younger than 18. And I think that's reasonable. And
Which I would just say I think should make the Call of Duty games being specifically designed as like future recruitment rules war crimes. But go on.
Or at least a violation. I like war crimes is probably a harder line, but we're talking like the difference between like felonies and misdemeanors.
Yeah, sure.
Thing. Like again, we're not lawyers here.
Yeah.
But what I want to point out is that I'm looking at the Wikipedia page for the OPAC. In the final negotiations, only 5 states still advocated against the straight 18 principle: Egypt, Kuwait, Singapore, the United Kingdom, and most trenchantly, and this is the words they use, the United States of America. And to me, USA. Like when you open this discussion, like you talked about Africa, right? And I think that like when you mention child soldiers to people, that is an image they get of like a black kid in Africa holding an AK-47. And that's just media propaganda, so to speak. Like that is it happens. Like I'm not saying it doesn't happen because someone took that picture, right? Why was that kid holding a gun? But when it comes down to the international law and the rules, like the US is like, no, we want to keep recruiting. Like we want to have these video game players like be able to join the army. And there are rules, and I think it has to do with like with parental consent, etc. But it's a mess. It's a huge mess, and I think we have to get over this idea. Frankly, like I think it's a racist idea that has been embedded in our news cycles and in our propaganda, that this is like a quote unquote African problem.
Yeah. No, I fully agree with that. And I hope I said something about that earlier. I think I did, but if I did not, part of why I was trying to bring up the Africa situation is I think that's what's in most people's heads. But like, yeah, I think it happens in all this, and that's why I also said like when you talk about even like gangs, it's not just black kids by any means, or Latino kids or other kids of color. I would argue that when like teenagers who have read lots of right-wing propaganda and go and shoot up schools or churches or things like that and leave racist messages, those are child soldiers who've been recruited. Like I would, and those are almost all white kids. Like I would put them in the child soldier category. Absolutely. So yeah, I think that's really important, is that like the African situation gets the most attention. And I think in some cases, like it's the most viscerally obvious, but it is absolutely happening in all sorts of parts of the world and has happened in all sorts of parts of the world. Like I love the Ken Burns documentary, but it often talks about how, like the heroism of these kids who ran off and said they were 18 and no one bothered to check. And there's a sort of like, and I think you see this in a lot of like movies about like World War II or the Civil War, where there's kind of a nudge and a wink of like, well, you shouldn't be here, but you're so awesomely patriotic and wonderful that you want to sign up at 14 that like we're still going to call you a hero, So
yeah. This also mentions, according to Child Soldiers International, the UK deployed 22 armed forces personnel aged under 18 to Iraq and Afghanistan between 2003 and 2010, and that's armed forces personnel under 18. So we're not even talking about just the recruiting. Like they sent them into combat zones under the age of 18. And again, like, did these kids possibly lie about their age? Yes. But again, we're not talking about, this is not the confusion of war. Like in an active combat, like, oh, we don't want to ID check this kid in the middle of a battle. This is like you sent them from your nation to another nation. Like you should have done your due diligence.
Yeah. And that's, I think, like, there's no battles happening on the literal streets of the United Kingdom or the United States of America. I mean, there have been attacks, but nothing, I think, that raises the kind of existential threat that I'm talking about in a place like Ukraine. And yeah, so I think that I'm not surprised because, given the timing, I think it was probably under Trump that the U.S. Was so trenchant about it. But I'm guessing that Biden and whoever came before him, whoever comes after him, would be just as trenchant because God bless the USA. But yeah, it's all.
You're talking about the OPAC?
Yeah.
No, because OPAC was like, it's actually, I think, 18 years old at least now.
Oh,
so
I think it was the last couple of years. Okay, that makes sense. I get that is so much more recent to Geneva. So anyway, we're getting pretty deep into legalese here, and as you said, we're not lawyers, but I think this is good discussions, and fans would love to hear what you've got to say. As always, you can find all the ways to contact us on theethicalpanda.com. Please do that. Riki, do you have any last comments you want to
make? We didn't even get to Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is I'm in the middle of watching right now. I had to stop watching because it was so emotionally devastating to me, one of the episodes. Because this one, not only are they kids, they're piloting mechas, but the EVAs, the mechas they use in this universe, like, are somehow psychically connected to the kids and respond emotionally to them, sometimes like subconsciously. So it is much more than just like kids piloting machines. Like, they respond to their emotions. And part of the reason this show is devastating is because the person who is in charge of this program is the protagonist's father, like literal father. And we talk about like how adults need to be responsible, and this is just like, I understand why this is so beloved, because the questions it brings up and the psychic damage it does to the audience and obviously to the characters is quite severe. It is a really good anime. I'm looking forward to finishing it eventually, but I needed a break because there was just one episode that broke the main character and broke me. So I look forward to finishing it, but oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Evangelion.
I definitely want to watch it. Mary and I have gotten a couple of like small season kicks of things, but I think it's definitely on our list to watch. So we will definitely be doing an episode about it at some point soon. Riki, thank you so much for bringing up this topic. Thank you, Jared, for helping to push us towards it as well. It's one we're going to have a lot more to say about. We want so much feedback from we want so much more feedback from our listeners and stuff like that. But we're going to pause for now. We're going to have some great bonus content about an idea about Star Wars that I've had. But for everybody else, thank you so much for tuning in. We have spoken. Welcome back to our members. As always, thank you so much. You're what helps keep our lights on. We've already been making some investments in better sound equipment. That's made possible in large part by the money we're getting from our members. So thank you so much for that. And I hope you're hearing a difference as we improve the sound quality, but we know we have a lot of ways to go. One of the discussions that's come out around the Acolyte and some of these other shows is, would these shows be better if they were dropped all at once, the way Netflix always does, or are they better episodic? And we're not going to get into that necessarily. We're going to get into a related question, which is that I have been making the point that I think when shows are really just one continuous story, making them week to week can be done well, but is very difficult because so often, like, episode 3 doesn't make sense until you've seen episode 6, and so if you're waiting 3 weeks in this internet culture, lots of people are like, "Oh, episode 3 makes no sense," because like we haven't seen how it actually pays off yet, or just there are all kind of problems that can happen. I think episodic TV can be great, but when it's actually more episodic. And some of my absolute favorite shows are things like Burn Notice or middle seasons of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where there is a kind of monster of the week, challenge of the week, but there's also some big bad that you're like getting hints about over the course of the season that becomes the focus of the last couple episodes. I am loving the more that we're getting about the Jedi, but we're still getting the stories where it's like these one group of Jedi about one specific mission. I would love an old style episodic television show, maybe 12 episodes, maybe a full 22, about a group of Jedi during the High Republic or even earlier and the missions that they go on. And one mission is, maybe like there's someone who's using the dark side, very much not a Sith, but like someone's got to be tracked down. But another mission is going to stop a war that's about to break out between two planets. Another is about going and figuring out a mystery. Another is about going to figure out an asteroid that's going to hit a planet, and they've got to figure out how to, meld space technology and the Force to avoid this. Another episode is about a Padawan who's really struggling with something, and how does that work? What do you think, Riki? Could this work as episodic television about the Jedi?
Maybe. Like, I agree with you. I need these TV shows to be done with like the 6 to 8, 10. I don't know. What Acolyte is going to be 8, right? So maybe like 6 to 8 episodes. The story over those episodes is too long to be a movie, right? A reasonable movie, I guess. Nowadays, movies are like 3-4 hours long. But they're too short to give us what you call the episodic treatment. And for us, I think like Andor is beloved. I think it's the best Star Wars we've gotten in a while, the best TV show I've seen in a long time. It's 12 episodes.
Yeah.
And it was very deliberately broken up into 4 sections, right? Of 3 episodes each. And that type of deliberate structure in the storytelling, I think, is one of the reasons it works so well and that we love it. And that like week to week, we knew where we were at the end of each episode, and we had like some idea of where it might go next. And then like we got a little bit more, and and it kept us going. Yeah. So I'm not sure, like what you propose, like any expansion of Star Wars lore and storytelling and new characters, I think can be good. Is good. Like, in my opinion, like I want more Star Wars. Give me more Star Wars. But I'm reaching a point where I'm like, you have to do it right. And I kind of reached a similar point with Marvel, where some of the things I was watching, I was like, I didn't enjoy that. Like, it didn't. I like seeing new characters, but it hasn't expanded my enjoyment of Marvel. Now, like, I'm starting to feel that with Star Wars, because the fundamental storytelling to me isn't working, like as a structure, as a TV show, the way Andor did. So that's what I think, is that it doesn't matter as much like who the characters are and what the story is. I just need the storytelling to be more structured, I think, is the word I want to keep using. Yeah.
I think that works. I think that's a good point. And I think, as I'm thinking about it, Paul points out that they're basically the old school TV miniseries, the 6 to 8 episode shows.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. And I think one thing is, remember, like, those shows were aired an episode a night, but often they were aired like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Or a lot of times like just 4 episodes, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, because everyone figured no one watches TV on Friday night. So it was like you were waiting a day instead of a week. And a lot of people were probably just, taping them on VHS and then gonna watch them all at the same time. And as I think about it, I do think there are 2 Star Wars shows that have done a fairly good job in their earlier seasons of doing this like somewhat episodic TV versus the big bad quest. And they do it very much in the way that Burn Notice does. And I'm talking about The Bad Batch and Mandalorian. Because in both of those, and this is something that Burn Notice often did, we know from episode 1 what's the big bad, what's the challenge. But basically there's all these side quests that are here. Like in Mandalorian season 1, it's much more purely episodic. We don't really get the Guinean stuff until later. Although obviously some of it's introduced at the very beginning. But like, for the Bad Batch, it basically, like, they know what their overall mission is, but then they have to go and get this part to fix their ship, and to do that they have to do this mission, and then like in one season they just are just doing side quests for Sid for like half the episodes, and which is very much like what the Mandalorian, what Burn Notice often was. And so, and in both shows, I think in the most recent seasons, they've become more like just one long plot, which I think was somewhat successful and somewhat not in both shows. But I think both shows have shown like you can do episodic Star Wars television. And
absolutely.
I think part of the thing is that we keep wanting to have these conversations about what the Jedi were really like, and like, is Clone Wars Jedi the real Jedi, or is High Republic, or is like earlier Jedi, or is Luke and Kanan the only like real Jedi, or Yoda, or whatever? I think it's because we've only ever seen the Jedi in crisis. We've seen the Jedi after they've been completely wiped out and are trying to be rebuilt. We've seen the Jedi as they're being wiped out. We've seen the Jedi as they're going through this real crisis moment of dealing with Darth Biceps. And like, I just don't think that there's like, and the big crises of the High Republic and stuff like that. And I would love to see a show that's about the Jedi being the defenders of peace in the galaxy, and see a little bit of the dark side of it, but mostly get to see the Jedi being heroes and solving adventures.
Yeah, my thing is I need good characters.
Yeah.
And I need good character development. I agree with you. Like Mandalorian season 1, obviously we get Mando Din Djarin, but we also get like a nice arc for Grief Karga, right?
Yeah.
We and in the individual episodes, the Seven Samurai episode where they defend the village is like a near perfect like single episode of TV.
Agreed.
In terms of like, we get a great action set piece fighting the ATST. We get some good like side characters introduced. The woman in the village, right? And even though she wasn't an ongoing character, she got good character development for a single episode of TV, and it was fun to watch her interactions with Din and to see like their interplay. And like, I would say like there was even some, like, wouldn't it be cool to see him like just settle down in that village with her, like to see them together, like type of thing. And that doesn't have to pan out as a long story, but I think it says something about the character and the writing for that episode that it was like very good. And I need like, okay, I'm not gonna say specific names, but like in the Acolyte, there are too many non-characters. They're just like plot devices to move from like one location to another, and that's what I don't like, is that I'm not getting time to learn who this person is before they're like not a part of the show anymore.
I would not agree with that, but let's save that conversation for another time. But yeah, but I definitely have seen other shows where I felt like that, where the characters, like, to me the Arrowverse was full of that, of characters who got developed, and whereas like characters who get development, and then other characters who, and even sometimes characters who get development but now have to act in a certain way just to move the plot forward, even though it completely goes against the way their character's been developing. And just go back to Mandalorian, I think you're right. Like, our main characters get that. We get one episode characters who get that, and then like Grief Karga, but like IG-88 gets character development. The Nick Nolte Ugnaught is only in 2 episodes, 3 episodes, but he gets character development. Everyone in that world. And Paul pointed out like Clone Wars and Rebels are also examples of more episodic TV. And I think that's definitely true of Clone Wars. I think Rebels is true of the first couple seasons. The later 2 become a little bit more like every episode following each other. But there's a lot of side quests again.
Yes. Like Clone Wars, look at Barriss Offee. It seemed like she was going to be a one of just like, here's another random Padawan to a random Jedi. And then they brought her back and did a very interesting story arc with her. And now they've brought her back in a spin-off show, Tales of the Empire.
Yeah. And I think that maybe the last thing I'll say about the show idea I have is that maybe one of the ways to do it is to make it animated. And this is like, Paul has really helped me understand this, going all the way back to the Justice League TV show, which is one of my favorites. And it has a cast of like 30 main characters because it's all the Justice League. And like, yeah, there's a lot more about Superman and Wonder Woman and Batman, but like, Aquaman has arcs, and Arrow and people in the Green Arrow and the people in his family get arcs. Like lots and lots of characters get their own arcs.
Yeah.
And keeping 30 live action actors under contract for a season is going to be almost, let alone multiple seasons, is going to be almost impossible. But having 30 voice actors who will come in once or twice a year for 3 to 5, 7 years, that's much more doable.
Well, it's not the contracts. Like, they're still under contract. It's the filming, right?
Yeah,
in live action, if you have an episode with Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, if it was live action, you have to have all 3 actors in the same location for however long. With voice actors, you can record those separately, individually, and then put it all together.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that also, like, but I guess what I meant for a contract is the exclusivity of a contract. Like, if you're doing a TV show like that, you probably have you can't book a movie during the time we're supposed to be filming this TV show. Whereas, you're doing movies, just schedule us 2 times during this 3-month period when we're doing the voiceovers, and you're golden. So anyway, so that's a fun thing. Maybe we'll get that show. Members, if you like the idea, let us know. Riki, as always, thank you so much. To our listeners, thank you. To our members, thank you so much. You're what makes this all possible. We have spoken. And we're out.